It lies on the outskirts of the European theater, and its position far to the north held little value for the empires of Central Europe, and yet, just like everyone else, Norway still had a part to play in the Great War. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about Norway and the First World War. For most of the century before the war, Norway was a part of Sweden. It was given to Sweden as a spoil of war in 1814, since Denmark-Norway had been allied with Napoleon, and Napoleon lost. Norway had tried to declare its independence, but a small war between Sweden and Norway in 1814 ended that, and it would then exist within Sweden and answer to the Swedish king. It did have its own parliament, though, and its own armed forces. Norway eventually wanted to control its own foreign affairs, and in 1896, when they tried to establish their own consulate services, Sweden threatened a military invasion. Norway did finally declare independence June 7, 1905, which happened mostly peacefully. There was a fear of war between the two, and both sides partially mobilized, but Sweden recognized Norwegian independence October 26, 1905. Post-independence, Foreign Minister Jørgen Løvland stated Norway's foreign policy, a wish to be left alone in order to get on with building a new nation. It would be absolute neutrality, and the government thought its geographic location sufficient to avoid being dragged into European wars. But even though Norway had no allies, it had a close relationship with Britain via trade. It also didn't hurt that Norwegian Queen Maud was British King George V's sister. Norway was poorly prepared politically to handle an international crisis at the outbreak of the war. And the war came as a great shock. In February 1914, during a hearing on defense spending, Prime Minister Gunnar Knudsen had even famously said, "Why should we invest everything in our defense forces? What is it that's looming?" That would be interesting to know. As of now, the political sky on the international stage is free of clouds, which has not been the case for many years. And then the largest war to that point in history began 5 months later. Norway declared its neutrality at the start. Actually, Norway did so twice, and then in December, the Scandinavian kings got together to do it again. Norway had expanded and modernized its armed forces for years in case of war with Sweden. The Navy had gotten new coastal defense ships, torpedo boats, and submarines. The coastline was fortified with big guns protecting harbors and cities. The fortress island Oscarsborg, outside of Oslo, was known as the Gibraltar of the North. It had minefields, an underwater battery, and even a hidden torpedo battery. But when it became apparent that there would be no war with the Swedes, the armed forces were economically neglected and fell behind other nations. But the coastal forces were mobilized in 1914 to prevent the warring nations from using Norwegian coastal waters. In November, the German cruiser Berlin entered Trondheim harbor. They said they had an engine malfunction and could not return to international waters. A coastal defense ship entered the harbor the next day, and the Berlin and its crew were interned for the duration of the war. This was what Norway feared on a larger scale. Britain or Germany using Norwegian harbors and fjords as bases, but both of them figured that a harbor or two was not worth bringing Norway into the war on the opposite side. Well, Sweden and Denmark as well, since they all said they would stick together. Thing is, Norway has vast natural resources, and as a neutral nation, could trade with both sides. In 1914, it had the fourth largest merchant fleet in the world and the largest per capita. And Norwegian merchants put their lives on the line if the money was worth it, sailing mined waters, through Entente blockades, and facing German unrestricted submarines. International demand for the fleet led to a financial boom. In 1914, it cost 5 crowns to transport a ton of goods across the North Sea. By 1917, it was 260 crowns. That's a 5,500% increase. This wealth did come at a cost. 889 Norwegian ships were sunk during the war, taking the lives of 2,000 Norwegian sailors. The government did, though, issue war insurance for all merchants. The civilian population had panicked at the war's beginning, emptying markets and banks of food and money. Rationing wasn't begun until 1918, though, and when commodity prices began rising, fixed prices were enforced and exports of foodstuffs were regulated. They even prohibited using potatoes and grain to make alcohol. Thing is, that economic boom in the merchant fleet didn't affect everybody and widened the gulf between rich and poor. This led to huge demonstrations, including one in 1917 when 300,000 people, an eighth of the entire population, took to the streets, and there was talk of revolution inspired by events in Russia. Also in 1917, Britain declared a coal embargo on Norway, claiming that Norway had not fulfilled the obligations of its trade agreements. This directly concerned the export of fish and pyrite, for explosives, to Germany. Norway stopped it, and the embargo was lifted. Also, to help the Norwegian fleet against German unrestricted submarine warfare, the government had a charter system with the British that let unarmed Norwegian merchants sail in safer waters in British service and armed Entente ships in hostile waters in Norwegian service. Norwegian ships also joined Entente convoys. This effectively entwined the Norwegian and Entente fleets and would be known as the Secret Tonnage Agreement. If the Central Powers had found out about it, you could say goodbye to Norwegian neutrality. There was one glaring weakness in the British blockade of Germany, the Norwegian Gap. Britain mined the North Sea, but those mines stopped short of Norway's coastal waters. German subs would sneak into the high seas using those waters. Huge pressure was put on Norway by the Entente to close the gap, but that didn't happen until the fall of 1918, when 775 mines were laid to block those waters. It looked on the surface like Norway would benefit from the war, a neutral nation with expanding trade and a market desperate for its merchandise. The real cost, though, was not apparent until the war's end. First of all, neutrality was expensive to maintain, with constant mobilization and equipment maintenance. The government controlled the purchase of goods, and fixed prices caused problems of their own. And government-insured shipping was really expensive. There were errors and ignorance, so that the government believed its finances were in order. It turned out that there was actually a massive debt accumulated during the war. And when international prices began to fall back to normal levels post-war, prices for Norwegian goods plummeted. So many farmers and fishermen who had invested in costly equipment now had large personal debts. And many municipalities had electrified the cities of the nation during the war by building expensive hydroelectric plants. When it came time to pay the bills, the income was not sufficient. And a majority of those municipalities went bankrupt. The nation building had a rocky start. But Norway had managed to remain neutral for the duration of the war, which was a feat, and thus managed to avoid the staggering loss of life that befell the other nations fighting the war. So for all the economic woes that came post-war, in that respect at least, Norway could count itself lucky. We'd like to thank Dietrich Johannesson for his help with the research for this episode. If you'd like to see our special episode about Sweden during the war, you can click right here for that. You should also check out our subreddit, because there's really good discussions and things like that over there. And do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.